My name is Commissioner Frank Avila, and I'm a commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. And I have two of my colleagues with me today. I have Commissioner Barbara McGowan. Hi, Barbara. How are you?
Hey, Frank. How you doing?
Good. Barbara, how long have you been a commissioner at the district?
I was first elected in '98 and was re-elected by the good people of Cook County in 2004.
That's so you've been a total so far of about 12 years now.
Oh no, Frank. Now you know that's not true. It hasn't been 12 years.
Oh my God,
maybe about 8. I mean, yeah. You know, you're trying to get me, in trouble here, right?
And then I have the other commissioner is Patricia Horton, and Patricia Horton is the youngest serving commissioner at the Water Reclamation District.
That's youngest serving, not youngest in age. Is that right?
No, Barb, let me tell. I'm the youngest. You're right. I've been there now for about a year.
And then I have as our guest Tim Williams. He's Managing Director of Government Affairs at the Water Environment Federation. And we brought Tim in from Washington, D.C., and we're going to talk. The name of our show is the Water Quality in the United States, and we're going to see a short film about the water quality and the infrastructure here in the United States.
I think the average American family probably has a bit of difficulty visualizing all the assets that are under our feet.
We don't understand the value and the services that we use just for our personal needs.
We're talking about a commodity that's essential to life. I can't imagine a more important resource than water.
You wouldn't let your house be 100 years old and not ever do any maintenance to it. You would make sure that it was safe. The problem we have is that our water infrastructure is old. 100, 200 years old. It's not been upgraded or fixed or replaced. It really demands attention by a community as your home does for an individual.
Water provides so many functions that relate directly to health and well-being.
100 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine turning on the tap water. And now it's an expectation.
The water infrastructure is life and death to people, just like our roads, streets, bridges, and buildings are life and death.
People see that their roads can cave in, their bridges can fall. Things that they can see are falling apart. But also, the infrastructure they can't see is falling apart. And that's the one underneath their feet.
We have about 2 million miles of pipe in this nation. If you're walking around in an urban area, you're probably stepping on a pipe.
They all have a life expectancy. If you don't maintain them and constantly check them and rehabilitate or repair, you're going to have a big problem. They're going to collapse. They're going to fail. And all of a sudden, the sewage will not have any place to go. It'll back up into homes. It'll back up onto the street. And you're going to have some very large messes to clean up. It's normally out of sight, out of mind. Once it comes to the surface, it's a whole other animal.
Every single day, you could have 100,000 gallons a day of untreated raw sewage with all those pollutants, bacteria, viruses, going into our waterways untreated.
You're talking about system-wide problems that would take tremendous human resources to correct.
On a national scale, if you looked at what we're spending now and you looked at the additional investment requirements over the next 20 years, there's a $540 billion difference.
The problem is large, and it's getting larger every year to adequately maintain these systems. And if it doesn't get under control, it's going to be out of control.
For the future of our economy, our schools, our individuals' public health, it's critical to reinvest and make whole this infrastructure that's falling apart.
We need to accept the responsibility that future generations need to be able to rely on those assets to have the same quality of life that we have.
Clean water is everybody's right, but it's also everybody's responsibility.
This was an excellent preview of what we just saw, liquid acid. Barbara, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Tim Williams?
I sure do, Frank. Tim, you know, we tend to take water for granted here in the United States. How much water does the average American use?
Well, you know, we do take water for granted. There's a lot of water in the United States, and there's a lot of water in the world. Water, they say, covers 70% of the Earth's surface. Here in the United States, it's estimated that each American uses an average of about 100 gallons of water every day. And
every day?
That sounds like a lot, but then when you think about all of the things that you use water for in your home, and water that's used in manufacturing, and all the ways that we rely on water, and that's how they come up with that average of about 100 gallons a day, and it just shows how important water is.
Okay.
That's really interesting. Also, Tim, how has clean water improved public health here in America?
Well, again, we take clean water for granted because of the good work that's done here in Chicago by the people at the Water Reclamation District and your colleagues all over the United States. So that disease from water is a relatively unusual thing in the United States. I believe they say that the last cholera outbreak in the United States documented was in 1911. That was related to waterborne disease. So that's just one example that we can take for granted, that we can turn on our tap and have clean water to drink without fear of disease. You know, it's not true everywhere in the world. They say that across the world there's about 1.6 billion people that don't have access to clean water, and sadly about every 15 seconds someone dies because they don't have access to clean water. So we can be very pleased that here in the United States we have access to clean water.
What are the challenges we face today?
Well, the biggest challenge we have is to take care of what we've got. There's this tremendous infrastructure, which is what the video that was just shown talks about, that's been built over decades, and most of it is underground and taken for granted, like I said, and it costs a lot of money to keep that infrastructure working properly, not just the network of pipes, but also the treatment plants, like the plants that are here in Chicago, and literally billions of dollars is spent every year, and billions more is needed to make sure that these treatment plants continue to do their job. That's just one part of the challenge. There are many other issues related to runoff from stormwater and pollution that could be caused by farms, but the challenge that has the biggest dollar figure associated with it is taking care of our water infrastructure.
Okay.
Well, that really sounds great, Tim. But can you explain what you mean a little bit more in depth about water infrastructure?
What is water infrastructure? You know, coming in from the airport this morning on the Blue Line, the train slowed because there was construction, and I was looking out the window, and I don't know if you've ever ridden the subway, and you see the lights in the tunnel, and they go by you, bop, 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 bop. Well, in between some of those lights, there was this room that was lit up, and I could see the workers for the Chicago Transit Authority in there doing whatever construction they were doing in their hard hats and everything like that. And that was a window into something that most people never see. And it's the same way with water infrastructure. Across the whole United States, there are 16,000 wastewater treatment plants, and I think about 800,000 miles of sewer pipes. And I don't know what the numbers are here in Chicago, but they're pretty large.
I think we have a slide that we could bring up on for the audience to see what is infrastructure.
Oh, we do. I think it's there you go, and you can see what I'm talking about there, that this is a network of pipes underground that collects, well, first of all, it delivers clean water to your home through a series of pipes that's called the distribution system, and then the used water, which might come from your kitchen sink,
wastewater,
or your shower or your toilet, is returned through a series of pipes called collection systems. And those pipes will take all of the wastewater to a treatment plant where it's treated according to the permit that the city has.
You know, here at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, we have 7 sewage treatment plants here. and one of the plants, Stickney, is considered one of the largest in the world. It could treat up to 1.4 billion gallons of wastewater a day.
Mm-hmm. And you guys know a lot about this. How many people do you think in Chicago know that they have the largest wastewater treatment plant in the world here in Chicago?
Well, you know, Barbara, Patricia, myself, we're out there every day, right, Patricia?
Of course, yes.
We want to inform the people here in Cook County that they're living in God's country.
That's right.
You know, here in God's country, you mentioned about surface water. And of all the surface water in the world, 1% is fresh water. And out of that 1%, 18% of that surface water is right here in the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And let's compare it to the United States. 90% of all the surface water here in the United States is right here in the Great Lakes.
Well, compare what's going on right now in the southeast part of the United States and in Atlanta and other cities where they're concerned about their supply of drinking water based on the fact that there's been a drought, and compare that to your situation here in Chicago being right on the lake.
Right. Well, let me ask you, Tim, what will this reinvestment in water infrastructure cost, and how will it get paid?
Well, I can tell you what some people think it will cost. How it will get paid is a tougher question to answer. There have been a number of government studies and experts that have estimated somewhere between $400 to $500 billion and $1.2 trillion. $400 to $500 billion to $1.2 trillion nationwide is what would be needed in order to maintain the water infrastructure that we have and make sure that it's rehabilitated, renovated, so that it continues to provide the level of service that we need. And that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And across the United States, I don't know what the exact numbers are here in Chicago, but across the United States, about 95% of the money to pay for our water infrastructure, and I'm talking about the cost of constructing physical facilities, plus the cost of operating and maintaining those facilities, 95% of the construction cost is paid for by local government, and 100% of the operation and maintenance cost is paid for by local government. So if you do the math on that, I think it's easy to see that probably the vast majority of that $400 to $500 billion or 1.2 trillion is going to come from local government. That's the way it has been, and that's probably the way it will be in the future. There's a big debate in Washington, where I work right now, over what the federal government's share should be. When the Clean Water Act was passed back in 1972, part of what was included in that act, there were what were called carrots and sticks. And the sticks were, everybody has to have a permit, and there were going to be standards and criteria for water quality and for discharges. The carrot that went along with that was a lot of federal grant money to help pay to improve sewage treatment. And that program was the biggest federal public works program after the interstate highway system. So you have the interstate highway system, and right after that is grants for wastewater treatment. And that grants program went from 1972 through the end of the 1980s, and it was replaced by a loan program. But the amounts of money that are spent every year by the federal government right now on water infrastructure are minuscule compared to what was spent in the 70s and 80s. And when you look at a number like $1.2 trillion, and the fact that 95% of that is coming from local sources, a lot of people would say, well, gee, can't the federal government step up and contribute a little bit more? And that's what a lot of the debate is about in Washington right now.
Well, the problem I see then is that you mentioned transportation, that transportation is the largest infrastructure construction project throughout the United States, but they do have a trust fund.
That's right.
And in the water infrastructure industry or wastewater, we do not have a trust fund.
That's right.
And I think that's the problem. Maybe we need a trust fund.
Well, a lot of people think that a trust fund would solve the problem. There are lots of, the devil is in the details with a trust fund, I would say. First of all, some people say that trust funds, there's no trust in trust funds. And you've seen the headlines about the so-called Social Security Trust Fund, and the money that I'm paying and you all are paying for Social Security really isn't going in a trust fund. It's going out next week to pay somebody's Social Security.
Right.
So there's concern that if there was a similar fund for water, to make sure that the funds actually are protected and spent for water, number one. And then number two, a question to ask is, where will the money come from? Most trust funds are created because there's a tax or a user fee associated with the use of that part of the infrastructure. The airport trust fund is funded through an airport, an airline passenger fee. The waterways trust fund is a tax on barges and things like that. The highway trust fund is a gas tax. So how can we identify a source of revenue for a water trust fund? Everybody agrees that water is very important. How can we identify a source of revenue for a water trust fund that makes some kind of sense in terms of being fair, because it's somehow associated with either use of water or the benefits of clean water, that isn't already being taxed? There's a famous saying in Washington by an old-time member of Congress who said, tax you, tax me, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree. Everybody wants to tax something else, and you can spend a lot of time studying this, and you'll find there aren't very many things that any of us do in our everyday lives that aren't already subject to some kind of tax. So finding some source of revenue that is associated with clean water, for example, manufacturers that use a lot of water in their processes to produce their products and rely upon water supply, that might be a fair place to look, some kind of tax associated with that. People benefit from clean water in lots of ways, recreation and boats and things like that. Maybe there's a way to raise money that way. So these are the details that we have to work out. But you're right, Frank, there is a lot of interest right now in a trust fund because the numbers are so large and because so much of the burden is on local governments already.
Yes, that was really great. But what can we do?
Well, part of what you guys can do is what you're doing right now, which is talking about this subject and helping to educate the public. As local officials, I think you guys have a very important role to play in bringing your colleagues, your other elected officials along. When was the last time that any of you could recall that there was a political campaign where water was an issue? Maybe it's because you guys are doing such a good job it isn't.
Well, we're living in God's country. This is the Great Lakes. I mean, we have,
we're trying.
But
we're trying to get it out there and get the message out there.
That's right. At the local level of government, everybody who's a local elected official spends a lot of time thinking about water and sewer and those essential services. But we need to do a better job of making sure that people in Springfield know about water infrastructure and that it's a high priority for our state legislators and the governor. And we need to do a better job of making sure that people in Washington, the people that we send there to represent us in Congress, have clean water and water infrastructure as a priority when they get there.
You know, our budget, our next year budget is going to be $1.3 billion.
Wow.
We're going to upgrade 3 of our largest wastewater plants in North America at a cost
3 at the same time.
Yeah, at the same time at a cost of $2.3 billion. Now, if we have to remove nutrients and disinfection, that may add another $1 billion, and no federal funding.
Right.
And this is a 40-year plan, a master plan that we just completed, and we're going to implement this master plan over 20 years because there's no federal funding. All the funding that is required to do the improvement has to come from the residents of Cook County. And that's why, as Commissioner, Patricia, Commissioner Horton, Commissioner McGowan, and myself were very concerned about funding, and that's why we're spending this over 20 years.
Well, then you guys understand what the dilemma is, and
Right.
that's you really don't have a choice. You have a responsibility to the community, and you're also legally liable in terms of the district is, maybe not you personally, legally liable for the performance of those plants. So they have to be kept in good working order. So whether there's any grant money coming from Washington or not, you guys have to bite the bullet and go ahead and make those improvements. It doesn't mean that you can't still work with Springfield and work with Washington,
of course,
and look for funding, but you guys have got to make decisions today because decisions today will affect the community, as you said, for the next 40 years.
Yeah. Tim, you mentioned the Clean Water Act a little while ago. Can you talk about what that Clean Water Act is and why the passage of this law in 1972 was so important?
Well, the Clean Water Act of 1972, which is Public Law 92-500, was one of several major statutes, environmental statutes, that were passed by the U.S. Congress in the 1970s. And you guys may not be old enough to remember Earth Day.
Thank you, I appreciate
all
that.
Of the things that, all of the things that happened around the environment in the 1970s, but there were some things that happened that caught the public's attention. There was a terrible oil spill off the coast of California. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland actually caught fire because there were pollutants floating on the top. And this caused a lot of alarm. There's a famous story of late Senator Chafee from Rhode Island, who was the longtime chairman of the Senate Environment Committee, talked about being on the presidential yacht on the Potomac River. And the guests on the president's yacht were offended by the odor that came from the Potomac River in Washington. So all of these things kind of collected in the public's consciousness. Do you remember the public service announcement that showed the Indian crying over litter? So there was a great sense of urgency to do something to better protect the environment, and one of the important laws that was passed during that time was the Clean Water Act. We're very lucky, those of us who work in clean water, because the Clean Water Act got it right. Some of the other environmental statutes needed to be changed, and there's litigation, and some people feel like they have not been as successful, and people think the Clean Water Act actually is probably our most successful environmental law. Like I said before, it required that every municipal and industrial discharger of pollutants have a permit. It set up a system where the federal government and the states set standards that go in those permits, and then it created a financing program to assist communities to improve their sewage treatment. So it was a profound step that was taken in 1972, and the benefits are apparent to all of us today.
Right. And that's really good, because another thing is what were the major water pollution problems, in 1972 that caused Congress to act?
Right. Well, things that were obvious, rivers catching fire, or rivers that smelled, sewage, discharges from industrial plants. Those were what was on the Congress's mind in 1972. And that was where most of the attention was placed in the 70s and 80s, was to bring sewage treatment, municipal wastewater treatment, up to an acceptable level. It's called secondary treatment. And on the industrial side, to bring industrial discharges up to an acceptable minimum level to address some of these very obvious sources of pollution that everybody agreed needed to be addressed.
And that's under the U.S. EPA.
Yes, EPA. And then the other thing that's pretty interesting about the Clean Water Act is it's a federal law, but the states have a lot of discretion, and the states are in the driver's seat in implementing many of the provisions of the Clean Water Act.
Is our water any cleaner today? And how
Yes.
do we know it is? I mean, I know it is. I work for Water Reclamation District, okay?
Yeah.
But how do we let other people know
Yeah.
that it's cleaner and tell them why?
It is cleaner. Now, there are lots of academic debates or scientist debate over how clean the water is and how much cleaner it is. But like I said, it's just a layperson like myself, or maybe you guys could know, well, the river in Cleveland hasn't caught fire recently, so we know that's cleaner. We know that people can go to the beach out here and not have to worry, so we know that it's cleaner. But there are lots of measures. There are programs that the state runs, and that federal agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey has a monitoring program, and they know from taking samples of water quality regularly over time how we're doing. And the Clean Water Act sets up a system where there's a goal for all waters of fishable, swimmable, but that every river has a classification, and we know that on average about 2/3 of all the waters that are sampled meet their goal in terms of how they've been classified. 1/3 do not. So we think that we've done a pretty good job. and especially addressing these, like I said, these gross sources of pollution that everybody was so concerned about in the 70s and the 80s.
Oh, that's good. But Tim, what has the cost been?
Billions and billions of dollars.
Since 1972.
Since 1972,
72, right.
I can tell you just the federal contribution under that grants program that I mentioned earlier was in the neighborhood of $60 billion. And of course that leveraged many billions of dollars more in expenditures by local governments.
And these are grants where you don't
And
have
the
to pay
private
it back.
sector.
Right.
A grant,
That's right.
you don't have to pay it back.
Yeah, yeah. So billions were spent. So when we talk about, that's important to keep in mind when we talk about there being a need to spend an additional $500 billion to $1 trillion, that's to protect the investment that we've already been making over these past 35 years.
What would you say the role of the federal government, states, and the cities is in addressing these problems?
Well, obviously a big role is to come up with the money to
with
pay
the money.
for the
We're back to the money.
infrastructure improvements that that we need. You might go to Washington and say,
Right.
"Show me the money," but that's one part of it. There is, like I said, with the Clean Water Act, there is roles are described for the feds and the state and local governments, but financing is a big part of that. And there is no silver bullet. There is no program in the future where all of the costs are going to be paid for by the federal government. Even in the 70s, most of the costs were paid for by local government, and that will continue to be the system in the future, I think.
So the U.S. EPA will set the criteria, and the various states, like here in the state of Illinois, the Illinois EPA implements
That's right.
and make sure that every wastewater agency plan here in the state follows those criteria.
That's right. That's right. And of course, as you guys probably know, the local government can be a regulator too, because you have a pretreatment program, and there are lots of facilities and dry cleaners and all kinds of things in a city that may rightfully put something down into the sewer system, but they have to meet certain standards to do that. So you guys are regulated by the feds and the state, but you're a regulator at the same time.
But nowadays we don't get any money from our regulators. That's a problem.
Yeah. That's right.
You know, in comparison, how do the problems that existed in 1972 compare to the problems that we face today?
Well, like I said a minute ago, the problems that we had in the 70s were obvious to everyone, that something had to be done because the river smelled or the river caught fire.
Right.
The problems that we have in the future are going to be a lot harder to address because it's a lot of things we can't see.
Is clean water a high priority in Washington?
Not high enough.
Not high enough.
Not high enough.
I don't think I like that answer.
You know, that's good. But what is
The air, the water, and all